On the 14th day of her hospital stay, Vivian Marsh received a phone call from her son that she would spend the rest of that year trying to understand. Not the words exactly. She had understood the words in the moment he said them. In the flat, careful way he delivered news, he had already decided she would not be able to change. The house on Cedar Road had been sold. The closing had happened 3 days ago. The new owners would be taking possession at the end of the month. He had handled everything. He wanted her to know he had done it for her own good. Vivian was 76 years old. She had been admitted to Grover County Hospital 14 days earlier with a hip fracture sustained when she slipped on the back steps on a Tuesday morning in February. The surgery had gone well. The recovery was going to take time. It was the recovery her son Dennis had explained first to the doctors and then, apparently, to a real estate agent, and then to a buyer that had made the house impractical. She could not manage it alone. She would need to go somewhere. He had found a facility. He had taken care of it. She held the phone after the call ended and looked at the ceiling of her hospital room. It was a plain ceiling, the kind hospitals have. White acoustic tile with a small water stain in the upper left corner that she had been looking at for 14 days. She had been looking at it and thinking, on and off, about the garden she was going to put in along the south fence when she got home. The roses she had been planning for 2 years. The herb bed she had been meaning to expand. She had been in the hospital for 14 days thinking about her garden, and her son had been selling her house. She did not cry. She was too old for the kind of crying that does not accomplish anything, and too angry for the kind that offers relief. She set the phone on the bedside table, and she looked at the ceiling, and she thought, with a particular clarity that arrives when everything else has been stripped away, he does not get to decide this for me. I am not finished. What Vivian did not know, lying in the hospital bed looking at the water stain on the ceiling, was that the abandoned greenhouse next door to her house on Cedar Road, the one that had belonged to old Mr. Fielding before he died, the one that had been standing empty for 3 years, with its glass panels going gray with dust and its door swollen in its frame, was holding something that had been waiting there, with a particular patience of things that do not know they are waiting, but simply are. Something that was going to change not just what Vivian owned, but what anyone could legally do with it. If you have ever had a decision made about your life by someone who told themselves it was for your own good, if you have ever been too far away to stop something from happening and come back to find it already done, if you believe that the ground under a life can hold more truth than the people walking on it, then stay with us, because what Vivian Marsh found inside that greenhouse did not just reverse a sale. It revealed something about the house she had lived in for 38 years that nobody, not Dennis, not the buyer, not the real estate agent, had thought to look for. This is her story. Vivian had moved to the house on Cedar Road in 1986, the year after her husband Walter died. This was not the obvious decision. The obvious decision, the one that her sister and her sister's husband and Dennis, who was 22 at the time and newly certain about most things, had all recommended, was to sell the house she and Walter had shared and move somewhere smaller, somewhere more manageable, somewhere that made sense for a 51-year-old widow. Vivian had listened to all of them and then bought the house on Cedar Road, which was larger than the house she was leaving, and had a south-facing garden with better light than anywhere else she had seen in Hartwell, Tennessee. She was a gardener, in the way that certain people are gardeners, not as a hobby, not as a weekend activity, but as a primary relationship with the world. She had been growing things since she was a girl in her mother's kitchen garden in East Tennessee, and the knowledge she had accumulated over 6 decades of growing was the kind of knowledge that lives in the hands as much as the mind, that cannot be fully described but can be seen in the way she moved through a garden, assessing and adjusting and coaxing with the unhurried attention of someone who understands that plants do not rush, and neither should the people tending them. Cedar Road was a quiet street in Hartwell, a small town in Middle Tennessee where the population had been more or less the same for 40 years, and where everyone knew what everyone else was growing in their garden, because the subject came up frequently and naturally in the way of communities where the pace is slow enough for such things to matter. Vivian's garden had been the subject of such conversations for 38 years. It was the garden that people slow their cars to look at in June. It was the garden that new residents on Cedar Road were told about by their neighbors before they had been there a week. Dennis had grown up in it. He had spent his childhood being handed things to carry and shown how to read the soil and told to be careful of the roots, always the roots. And he had absorbed none of it with any particular enthusiasm, being a child who preferred the indoors, which Vivian had accepted because children are who they are and not who you would design them to be. He had grown into a man who lived in Nashville and worked in insurance and came home 4 times a year and found the garden beautiful in the way people find beautiful things they have no relationship to from a comfortable distance. He was a good son in the ordinary sense. He called regularly. He came when he said he would come. He helped with the larger repairs when they were beyond what Vivian could manage, and he did so without making her feel the help was a burden being recorded somewhere. He was not, or so she had believed, for 54 years, the kind of man who would sell his mother's house while she was in the hospital recovering from surgery. She had believed a great many things for a great many years that February had required her to revise. The legal mechanism Dennis had used was a power of attorney. Vivian had signed it 4 years earlier, during a period when her health had given her some concern, and her attorney, a man named Carl Pruitt, who had handled her affairs for 20 years, had recommended it as a standard precaution for someone living alone. It gave Dennis the authority to manage her financial affairs in the event she was incapacitated. Carl had explained it carefully. Vivian had understood it as a document for emergencies. She had not understood that a hip fracture and a 14-day hospital stay would constitute, in her son's assessment, a sufficient emergency to sell her home. She called Carl from the hospital the morning after Dennis's call. Carl was quiet in the way of attorneys who are hearing something they did not anticipate and are simultaneously processing its implications. He said he needed to look at the documents. He said he would call her back. He called back that afternoon. The sale, he said, had been executed by Dennis acting under the power of attorney. The property had been transferred to a buyer named Thomas Hale, a man from Nashville who appeared to be purchasing the property as an investment. The sale price was below market value by an amount that Carl described carefully as significant. Dennis had also, Carl noted with the particular neutrality of a man choosing his words with precision, deposited the proceeds into a joint account he had established with Vivian's bank details without her knowledge. Vivian listened to all of this. Then she said, "Carl, can it be reversed?" Carl said, "Vivian, I need to be honest with you. A power of attorney gives broad authority. The question of whether Dennis exceeded that authority in a way that constitutes a legal breach is something we would need to argue. It is not a simple reversal. It would require demonstrating that the sale was not in your best interest, that the price was unconscionable, that Dennis acted outside the scope of what the document permitted. It is possible. It is not guaranteed, and it will take time." "How much time?" Vivian asked. "Months," Carl said. "Possibly longer." The facility Dennis had arranged was a place called Meadow Glen, which was clean and adequately staffed, and which Vivian assessed, upon her discharge from the hospital, with the same direct attention she brought to everything. It was a place where people went when their lives had been reduced to a manageable size. The rooms were pleasant. The food was adequate. The garden outside the main building was maintained by a service that came once a week and treated it with the impersonal efficiency of people servicing equipment. Vivian looked at that garden on her first day and decided she would not be there long. She had nowhere else to go. But she had decided, and the decision was the thing she held on to through the weeks that followed. When the legal process Carl was pursuing moved with the particular slowness of legal processes involving family members and property, and the complicated question of what a power of attorney does and does not permit. Arthur Fielding had been Vivian's neighbor on Cedar Road for 26 of her 38 years there. He was a retired botanist who had spent his career at a university in Nashville and had come to Hartwell in 1984, 2 years before Vivian arrived, to live in the house next door and tend the greenhouse he had built in his backyard with the particular devotion of a man who has spent a career studying plants and now simply wants to grow them without anyone requiring him to publish about it. They had become friends in the way that neighbors become friends when they share a fence and a serious interest in growing things. Arthur knew the Latin names of everything in Vivian's garden, and occasionally offered opinions on her planting decisions that Vivian found useful approximately half the time, and politely ignored the other half. Vivian brought him things from the kitchen meals when he forgot to eat, which was more often than it should have been, preserves from the summer harvests, bread on Saturdays. They had coffee across the fence most mornings when the weather allowed it, and talked about what was growing and what was not, and why. Arthur died in the spring, 3 years before the events of this story, at 84, in his own house, quietly. He had no family that Vivian knew of. The estate had been handled by a Nashville firm that Carl Pruitt had helped her identify when she wanted to understand what was happening with the property next door. The greenhouse had been listed as an asset of the estate, but had not sold with the house. The house had been purchased by a young couple from out of town who had no interest in a greenhouse and had negotiated it out of the sale. It sat in legal limbo, technically part of the estate, practically abandoned, its glass panels collecting dust and its door swelling in its frame through 3 seasons of weather. Vivian had a key. Arthur had given it to her years before he died, in the casual way of old friends who trust each other with the practical details of their lives. Here is the spare key in case of emergencies. Here is who to call if something happens. Here is what matters. She had kept it on her keychain without thinking about it, the way you keep things given to you by people you expect to be there for a long time. It was still on her keychain when she left Meadow Glen on a Thursday morning in April, 6 weeks after her discharge from the hospital, and drove to Cedar Road. She had told the staff at Meadow Glen she was going to a medical appointment. This was not entirely untrue. She did have a follow-up scheduled that afternoon. But the morning was her own, and she used it the way she had decided. Lying in her room at Meadow Glen, looking at a ceiling that was also white, and also had a small imperfection in the upper left corner that she had been tracking with the particular attention of a woman who had decided she was not going to be defined by the room she was currently in. She parked on Cedar Road and sat in the car for a moment. The house looked the same from the outside. This was the thing about houses. They did not register the changes in their ownership on their exteriors. The same white siding. The same front garden that she had planted and tended for 38 years, which in April was just beginning to show the first green of the season pushing up through the winter soil. Someone else's house now, technically. She did not look at it too long. She walked around the side, through the gate that connected her old property to Arthur's next door, a gate they had installed together in 2003, because walking around the block to have coffee across the fence had begun to seem unnecessary. She used her key on the greenhouse door. The lock resisted and then gave, and the door swung inward with a particular sound of something that has been closed for a long time finally opening. The greenhouse smelled of earth and old wood, and something green and persistent that had been maintaining itself in the absence of anyone to tend it. The benches along both walls still held the remnants of Arthur's last season of work, empty pots, a few tools, seed packets that had faded beyond legibility. The glass panels above let in the April light in the particular diffused way of glass that is not quite clean, soft and slightly gray, and still enough to grow things in. She was not entirely sure what she had come for. She had told herself she wanted to check on the greenhouse to see if Arthur's more delicate perennials had survived the winter without care. This was true. But she had also come because the greenhouse was the last place on Cedar Road that still felt like hers, or close enough to hers that the distinction had not yet fully registered. She was checking the bench along the north wall when she noticed the drawer. Arthur had built the benches himself in the first year after the greenhouse was completed. They were solid and well made in the way of things, built by people who intend them to last, with a lower shelf for larger pots and a shallow drawer built into the front of the bench at waist height. The kind of drawer you might not notice if you were not looking for it, because it sat flush with the wood and had no visible handle, just a small brass pole set into a routed groove. Vivian had known about the drawer. Arthur had kept seed records in it, small index cards with his precise handwriting noting what had been planted when and with what results. She had looked at those cards once, years ago, when he had asked her to retrieve something while he was occupied with a specimen on the other bench. She had not thought about the drawer since. She pulled it open. The seed cards were still there, bundled with a rubber band that had gone brittle. Beneath them, in a manila envelope that had been placed there deliberately and carefully in the way Arthur did everything deliberately and carefully, was a document. She stood at the bench in the diffused April light and opened the envelope and read what was inside. It took her 3 readings to understand it fully, not because the language was complicated. It was, in fact, remarkably clear for a legal document, but because what it said was so far outside what she had understood about her own property for 38 years that her mind kept sliding off it and having to come back. The document was a deed restriction. It had been filed with Grover County in 1952 by the original developer of the Cedar Road properties, a man named William Hobart, who had built the houses on that street as part of a planned residential development. The restriction applied to all properties in the Cedar Road development, 14 houses in total, and it specified that no property in the development could be sold without the written consent of all adjacent property owners, a condition that Hobart had included, the document noted in its preamble, to protect the character and continuity of the neighborhood he was building. It was not a common restriction. It was not the kind of thing a standard title search always surfaced, particularly if the search was conducted quickly by someone who was motivated to complete a transaction rather than find reasons to complicate it. But it was a recorded restriction, and it had never been legally dissolved, and it had been in force, unnoticed, for 72 years. Vivian was an adjacent property owner to the greenhouse property next door, which was technically part of the Cedar Road development. She had not given written consent to the sale of her house. Nobody had asked her. She stood in Arthur's greenhouse in the April light and held the document and thought about Arthur Fielding, retired botanist, who had known about this restriction and had put it in the drawer under the seed cards and had given her the key to the greenhouse years before he died and had trusted, with the same patient faith he applied to everything he grew, that she would find it when she needed it. She put the document back in the envelope and the envelope in her coat pocket, and she walked back through the gate to Cedar Road and got in her car and called Carl Pruitt. Carl Pruitt had been practicing law in Hartwell for 35 years. He had seen most things. He had not seen this particular thing, which was perhaps why, when Vivian described what she had found, he asked her to read it to him over the phone, slowly, and then asked her to read it again, and then said, "Vivian, where are you right now?" "In my car, on Cedar Road," she said. He said, "Can you bring that document to my office this afternoon?" She said, "I have a medical appointment at 2. He said, "After the appointment." She went to the appointment, and then she went to Carl's office. He read the document with his reading glasses on, twice, in the careful way of a man who wants to make sure he is seeing what he thinks he is seeing before he says anything about it. Then he set it down and looked at Vivian. He said, "This is a recorded deed restriction. I'm going to verify it at the county office this afternoon. But if it is what it appears to be, and it appears to be exactly what it says it is, then the sale of your property was executed without satisfying a recorded condition of transfer, which means the sale may be voidable." Vivian said. "Maybe," Carl said. "Will be. I want to verify before I promise you something I cannot deliver." "But Vivian, if this restriction is recorded and current and has not been dissolved, then Dennis did not have the legal authority to complete this sale, regardless of what the power of attorney permitted. The restriction supersedes his authority. The buyer's title is defective. This goes back." Vivian looked at Carl for a moment. She had known him for 20 years. She had never seen him look quite like this. She said, "Arthur knew, didn't he?" Carl said, "It looks that way." She said, "He put it where I would find it." Carl said, "It looks very much that way." Vivian nodded. She picked up her coat from the chair beside her. She said, "Call me when you have verified it." He called her the next morning. The deed restriction was recorded. It was current. It had never been dissolved, amended, or legally challenged in 72 years. Carl found it in the county records within 40 minutes of starting his search, which told him everything he needed to know about how thoroughly the title search for Dennis's sale had been conducted. The legal process that followed was not simple, but it was considerably more straightforward than what Carl had been pursuing before Vivian found the envelope in Arthur's greenhouse. A defective title is a specific and serious problem for a property transaction. Thomas Hale, the buyer, had a title insurance policy, which meant that his insurance company had a significant interest in understanding what had happened. The real estate agent who had handled the transaction had a professional liability exposure. Dennis's attorney, when contacted by Carl, took approximately 48 hours to return the call, and then returned it in the manner of someone who has spent those 48 hours consulting their own counsel. Carl was precise and methodical and unhurried in the way of attorneys who know they are standing on solid ground and have no reason to rush. He filed the appropriate challenges. He documented the restriction. He corresponded with Thomas Hale's attorney and with the title insurance company and with the real estate agent's liability carrier. He kept Vivian informed at each step with the same careful clarity he had always brought to her affairs. Dennis called Vivian 4 weeks into the process. She had been expecting the call. He said he had not known about the restriction. She believed this was probably true and said so, which seemed to surprise him. She said, "Dennis, not knowing about something does not make it not your fault. You sold my house without asking me. You used a document I signed for emergencies to do something I would never have agreed to. Whether the restriction existed or not, that was wrong." Dennis was quiet. She said, "Carl will be in touch." The sale was voided 4 months after Vivian found the envelope in the drawer under the seed cards. The title reverted to her. Thomas Hale was compensated by his title insurance company for his costs and his inconvenience. The real estate agent settled a separate matter with her liability carrier. Dennis paid Carl's legal fees as part of the resolution, which Carl had negotiated with the particular satisfaction of a man who had been practicing law for 35 years and occasionally got to do something that felt unambiguously right. Vivian left Meadow Glen on a Tuesday morning in August and drove to Cedar Road and unlocked the front door of her house and walked inside. The house had not been lived in for 6 months. Thomas Hale had not moved and the legal challenges had begun too quickly for that, and so the house had simply been empty, held in a legal suspension that had prevented anyone from doing anything with it. Vivian walked through it room by room on the first morning and assessed it with the same direct attention she brought to everything, noting what had been 6 months without maintenance and what had not. The house was fine. Houses that have been well maintained for 38 years do not fall apart in 6 months. The garden was another matter. 6 months without attention in a garden that had been tended for 38 years produces a particular kind of disorder, not chaos, not devastation, but the quiet insistence of growth without direction, of things that had been shaped by long practice returning to their own inclinations. The roses she had been planning to plant along the south fence were still unplanted. The herb bed had gone to seed in the ways herb beds go to seed without management. The lawn had grown and then been pressed down by the winter and was now at the ambiguous stage of early recovery that requires attention and patience in equal measure. Vivian put on her gardening clothes on the first morning and went outside. She worked for 3 hours before she came inside for tea. Then she went back out. She was not trying to restore the garden to what it had been in a day or a week. She understood, as she understood everything about growing things, that restoration is not a single act, but a sustained practice. That you do not repair 38 years of relationship with a garden in an afternoon. That the garden needed to understand she was back, and she needed to let it understand this at its own pace. In September, she planted the roses along the south fence. 2 years of planning, one purchase at the nursery in town, one afternoon of planting with the methodical care she brought to everything she put in the ground. She planted them and watered them and stood back and looked at where they were and thought about Arthur Fielding, who would have had opinions about the placement and would have expressed them across the fence with the precision of a retired botanist who had spent 60 years thinking about where things should grow. She thought about the greenhouse, about the seed cards in Arthur's careful handwriting, about the envelope placed under them with the deliberateness of a man who trusted that the right person would find it at the right time. She thought about the key he had given her years before he died, casually, the way you give someone a key when you trust them with the practical details of your life. She thought about the fact that Arthur had been a botanist and had spent his career studying the way things grow and had understood, perhaps better than most people, that growth requires patience and that the right conditions for something to emerge are often not the conditions anyone would have chosen or planned for, but they are the conditions that arrive, and what you do with them is the only thing that matters. She went inside and made herself tea and sat at the kitchen table and looked out at the garden in the September afternoon light, and she thought, I am still here. The garden is still here. The south fence has roses on it at last. She picked up the phone and called her sister. She kept Arthur's key on her keychain. This was a decision she made consciously, aware of what it meant to make it. The key no longer opened anything. The greenhouse had eventually been incorporated into the purchase of the adjacent property by a young family who wanted the space for their children, and Vivian had facilitated that transfer properly, with all the adjacent owner consents that the Cedar Road restriction required, and with the satisfaction of watching a piece of land she had known for 3 decades pass to people who were going to use it and love it. But she kept the key, as a reminder of what it meant when someone trusted you with the practical details of their life, as a reminder that the things people leave us are not always the things we expect, and are not always labeled clearly, and sometimes require us to go looking for them in places we had not thought to look, at moments we would not have chosen, for reasons that only become clear afterward. Dennis came to Cedar Road in October. He called first, which he had not always done, and she told him he could come. He sat at her kitchen table, the same table where she had read the titles and the legal documents and the letters from Carl over the preceding months, and he said, "The things a person says when they have done something they cannot undo and know it, and are trying to find language adequate to that knowledge." He did not make excuses. She gave him credit for that. She told him she was not ready to resolve it. That was the word she used, resolve. She said, "I am not ready to resolve this yet, Dennis. What you did was wrong, and I need more time before I can sit across this table from you and have it feel resolved." He nodded. She made him tea. He stayed for an hour, and they talked about other things, which was its own kind of beginning. The garden went into its winter rest in November. Vivian cut back the roses along the south fence with the care she always brought to the autumn cutting. The particular attention to what should be left and what should be removed that comes from decades of knowing a plant and understanding what it needs to return strong in the spring. She worked through the afternoon and finished as the light was failing, and stood at the south fence and looked at what she had done. The roses were bare now. They would be bare through the winter. They would come back in April, which was 6 months away, which was also the same amount of time her house had been sold out from under her and restored to her, and which seemed, standing at the south fence in the November dusk, like less time than it had seemed in February. She gathered her tools and went inside. She washed her hands at the kitchen sink and put the kettle on and looked out the window at the garden going quietly into its rest. The key to Arthur's greenhouse was on the hook by the back door, where she had always kept her keys, which was where it would stay. She made her tea. She sat at her table. The house was entirely hers, the way it had been for 38 years and the way it was going to remain. If you have ever had someone make a decision about your life and tell you it was for your own good, if you have ever come back to something that was taken from you and found it waiting, if there is someone you have trusted with the key to something important, or someone who trusted you with theirs, then this story belongs to you. Because Vivian Marsh did not get lucky. She got what Arthur Fielding had prepared for her, with the patience of a man who understood that the right time for things is rarely the time you would choose, and always the time that arrives. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded that the things done to us without our consent are not always the last word. That what is recorded and true does not disappear because no one looked for it. That a key kept on a keychain for years without knowing why is sometimes exactly the key you need. Thank you for being here with us today. We will see you in the next story.